Okay, so first of all, welcome everyone to our webinar/workshop today, which is all about online forms. So conversion killers to conversion winners. So what we'll be taking you through is essentially how to diagnose issues with your forms, the problem areas, and then how to fix or go about fixing some of the common issues you might come across. A little bit of housekeeping, we'll be taking questions and answers, but we'll do all of those at the end. If you could just add any questions you have to the Q&A function, and we'll pick those up at the end there. So first up, a few introductions. My name's Alan. I'm the Managing Director of Zuko Analytics. For those of you who don't know Zuko, it's a form analytics platform, basically been designed to tell you when, where, and why your potential customers are dropping out of your form. So obviously there's a lot of synergy around the form optimization topic there as well. I have my colleague here, Lena.
Hello. Hello.
Who's one of our account managers. And of course, today we've got with us Abi Hough, one of the foremost UX consultants around, got her own consultancy, UU3, which does a lot of work around UX improvement and what have you. But I'll hand over to Abi because she will introduce herself and take you through the start of the webinar, if that's okay. Over to you, Abi.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, okay. So are we going to turn cameras off now and then?
Yeah, we'll turn cameras off.
Right.
No distraction.
Apologies, guys. Hang on a minute. Okay. So welcome to the webinar. Alan's given us a very nice intro. As he mentioned, my name is Abi. I've kind of been in this industry for more years than I care to mention. And I've got a bit of a reputation for being quite straight talking. Just a heads up for this entire webinar. There might be some swearing, but apologies. I've been dealing with websites generally for about 20 years or so. Started as a front-end developer, then moved into wondering why my websites weren't doing as well as they should have, which led into more sort of interest in the UX side of things. Part of my work is to carry out audits on websites for clients across desktop, mobile and tablet. And from the audits that I've done, I've raised thousands of issues that need to be fixed, whether they're functionality problems or UX problems, a whole plethora of issues to be resolved. And probably raised about 250 million for those clients in lost revenue from their websites because of functionality issues that they have had. Apart from auditing websites, I've also run thousands of A/B tests, and that's right the way from doing the research to designing and building, QAing, running and analysing the results. And that's given me lots of opportunities to discover what works most of the time, discovering new learnings or failings, whichever you want to call it, on numerous occasions, and also figured out what you really shouldn't be doing. So that's a bit about me. Let's carry on with the webinar. So what have I learned in all of this experience of mine? Well, basically forms still suck. There are crap forms everywhere. And nearly every audit that I carry out, one of the main issues are to do with interactions on the forms with users and the conversion rates of those.
Yeah, and Abby, obviously we can see that from our side. We see forms every day, and there's, you know, very rarely you get a form that doesn't have an issue or something that can't be improved because of the better user experience it's creating.
Yeah, that's really true. And for any audit that I do, I would say a quarter of the issues raised relate to the forms on the site. So it's a big area to look at and a good point to start optimizing and improving for your users. Cool. So we need to fix forms generally from what I've seen working in the industry, but why do we need to fix them? Well, it's not just for my own sanity, but there are lots of other reasons. So let's take a look. So forms are really the only way that your users can send you information about them. Use forms or form elements to for your users to tell you what they want. So selecting product options or filtering for products or searching for a product. And once they've found that product, they need to tell you who they are if they've decided to purchase it. So their name, their contact details, delivery information, and payment information. So forms are everywhere pretty much. So we need to make sure that they work. And what you might be thinking is, like Jose here, our little Mexican spider who looks very happy about his form, you might think your forms are doing just as well. But that's not the truth of it from what I've seen, and from what many, I'm sure Alan would agree, from what he's seen from the forms that he deals with.
No, certainly, definitely some of the examples in the show.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So how it's actually going, in my view, is a bit like this penguin that's been pecked on the butt. You're setting your users up to fail when it comes to your forms. Most of them are still really difficult to use in terms of the UX and UI. They are poorly designed and implemented cross-device in particular. They've got bugs that prevent or hinder completion of the form, and they make your users think way too hard. So lots of system 2 thinking going on. And there's also a question about the user might ask, which is, why are you asking me this? So requesting too much information from your user.
And so sorry, Abby, just to add a little bit quantitative data to that, like the studies we've done at Zuko and also other external studies have shown that about 2/3 of form visitors don't complete your form successfully. So there's a large group of users who don't complete, and a lot of room for improvement, and that kind of backs up what you were saying there.
Yeah, I totally agree. They are one of the biggest conversion blockers, and you can do all you like further up the funnel, but if it all rests on a form at the end and that form is bad, you're wasting your time. So a bad form basically means bad conversions, bad user experience, bad customer retention. Who's going to want to redo that anytime soon? There's also, bad accessibility, which is a whole raft of other problems that you need to be dealing with. It's just bad everything, and you're setting yourself up to fail. A bit like if you were going to enter the Squid Games, for example, which was an awesome series. Everybody should watch that. So we know that forms in general are pretty awful, but how do we go about fixing them? So we're going to run through sort of my process for how I evaluate a form and the steps that we need to complete in order to do that thoroughly and correctly. So the first step is to discover all the pain points that your form might be imposing on your user. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this, but this is the sort of standard list that I would go through to evaluate a form. The first thing we can look at is setting up GA tracking. So this allows you to input into GA any sort of form errors that you might be getting. There's a great article that I've linked to here from a guy called Charles Meaden, who basically gives you four steps to do this. So it's creating a new trigger in GTM, and then identifying the unique ID from any given form input error that you wish to track, adding that unique ID to a trigger, and then creating a new tag. So this approach is great because most of you have probably got Google Analytics in place or some kind of analytics, and it's really good for basic error tracking. So just to keep a baseline of how your form's doing. It allows you to filter by device type, so you can see if it's performing better on desktop, tablet, mobile, or where the problems are. And it's really good for setting up a tripwire, so sort of a red flag alert for anything that might be going wrong on your form. The downsides are that it kind of depends on your technical capability, because it will require some dev time in order to implement the triggers and the tagging. And if you want to do anything complicated, it can get quite tricky quite quickly. And it's also just numeric data that you get back. So you will, have information about how many times that message has come up, but it's not going to give you a reason as to why. Next, we want to have a look at something like Hotjar or a similar solution. If you haven't got something like this set up on your website, you probably want to ask yourself why that is. It really is wonderful for getting insights into how your website's performing generally or particular areas of it. But from what I've found with the clients that I've dealt with, it can possibly become an insight wasteland. So we have it all set up, but nobody's bothered to look at the data that it's gathering. So you really need to dedicate, time on a weekly basis to dive into the data. It's going to give you lots of useful things to look at, such as heat, click and scroll maps, recorded user sessions. You can set up live feedback and surveys. I believe they're offering a free trial at the moment, so if you haven't got it, you should get it. One of the downsides is previously they did have some form tracking functionality on there, but they have now killed that, which is a shame. Probably good for Alan though.
Yeah, we get a lot of Hotjar customers who use Hotjar for the heat maps, and they say, "Well, they don't do forms anymore. Can you look at that for us?"
Yep.
So yes.
Good for you then. And as I've mentioned, it's also a bit of an insight silo. So things get put in there, nobody bothers looking at it. But I can't stress how important that it is that you look through, you set up the reports that you want, and you look at those on a regular basis. Another thing we can look at is customer surveys and live feedback. So a great question to ask post-purchase would be, what was the number one thing that stopped you from purchasing today? Or if you want to kind of evaluate how a specific page is doing. So for example, if you had your form page, you could ask a question like, what's holding you back from completing whatever the task might be right now? And ask the users to be as specific as possible. The advantages of this, it's going to tell you how your users are actually feeling with the direct feedback from them. And it's also going to let you gain other insights at the same time that might not be directly related to the problem or issue you're trying to solve. The disadvantages are that the data can be quite messy, so you can get a lot of noise in there, and it takes some time and effort to sort of distill the key takeaways. And as I'm sure most of you have probably come across, if they're poorly implemented, it can have a detrimental effect. So things like the placement of where that survey or live feedback is in the viewport, and also the timing of it. So I'm sure everybody here has also been asked to complete a survey when they landed on a website 30 seconds ago or immediately. That's not great. So there are some clever things you can do around timing that allow the most appropriate time for you to trigger that survey or live feedback. For example, if a user has been faffing around on a page for a certain amount of time, that might be a good indicator that there's something wrong or a good point to get the feedback. This one is kind of my specialty, and that's device testing. What I'll say from the outset, if you're using Chrome Dev Tools or any kind of emulator or simulator, you're not device testing. That is not the best way to do it. In order to do device testing correctly, you really need to have the real devices that represent your users. So physical phones, tablets, and etc. that your users are using. This is usually 2 or 3 different mobiles of various sizes and operating systems, 1 tablet, and a desktop running Windows and Mac, and can run at different resolutions. You can use browser stack, but I would see this as a last resort over a physical device. And once you start testing with the physical device, you'll see what a difference it makes. So the advantages are you're testing what your users use, so not what's sat on your desk at the minute. You know, a lot of us will have a giant iPhone, whereas your users probably commonly will be using an iPhone 6s. It's much better for assessing the UI and UX, that physical device with your website, and I can probably guarantee you that you're going to find more bugs. Disadvantages are that you're going to have to figure out what those devices that you need to test with should be. There's a great article that I've got a link to there that you can have a look at. And you might see that the cost would be prohibitive to set up your own device library. That's not actually the case, because you can buy these devices secondhand and they don't cost that much at all. So you don't have to have brand new sparkly devices, because most of your users are not going to have brand new sparkly devices. They'll be on older devices that you probably don't expect. Just going to grab a drink. Another point that you can have a look at is getting an expert in to review your website or your form. So what I found is sometimes when you are working on a particular project for a given amount of time, and that's all you're focusing on, sometimes you just can't see the wood for the trees, okay? It's a bit like users and banner blindness. They just don't see it even though it's right in front of them. And oftentimes it's better to get a fresh set of eyes on your website or your form or whatever it might be, because they're going to pick up the stuff that you've missed, whether you've missed it intentionally or not, they'll find it. They'll also identify the opportunities that you haven't even considered, for example, and you'll get a massive list of recommendations to have a look at. One of the frequent arguments I get against this, again, is the cost, but usually the return on investment is substantial. So to give you an example of that, an audit that I carried out cost about £8,000. One issue, actually this is really quite cool. One issue that was found, actually we worked out, once it was identified, the company was losing £133 million a year because of this one issue. So they spent 8K on an audit and we managed to recover roughly about 133 million. So identifying that, so well worth the cost. And next we're going to move on to Zuko, which is where I hand over to Alan just for a little bit so he can talk you through how that can help you identify the problems.
As Abi says, Zuko is another option to identify where the issues might be with your form. You can see the pros and cons there. One thing I would add to that, it's very easy to set up compared to the likes of Google Analytics. You don't need to be a developer. There's just a couple of tags to add to your forms and Zuko will automatically pull everything through. But what I'm going to show you today is essentially some real life examples of how we can use data to identify exactly where the issues are in your form. And so the first obvious place to start, if we can shift slide, is on abandonment. So specifically, where do users abandon? So what is the last thing they touch before they leave the form? And what you need to look at here is two things. One is the volume. So, you know, which areas are people abandoning on the most? So you can see that there. We've got basically the fields on the left. And so you can see employment, this is a particular financial form, the submit button, and also a question about employment status is causing issues that people are abandoning on. So obviously you want to home in on those, but you also want to look at the abandonment rate as well. So that's slightly different. It basically is calculated the amount of people who interact with a field, what proportion of them leave on that particular field. And it's particularly important if you have a conditional form, because some questions may not be shown to all users. So they might not have a high abandonment volume, but they might have a high abandonment rate. So you can see in this particular case, there's a button which is an ID check. It's got a 37% abandonment rate, which is very high. So that's obviously, again, something you want to look at. I think in this particular case, it's an ID check, so it's probably just kicking off under 18s. But if you have something like that, it's a good way to identify a great starting point to look at the particular issues that you might have on your form. The next thing you need to look at is actually a difference in behavior. So there's two types of people who visit your form, those who abandon it and those who successfully complete, which is obviously a great thing. So if you can identify different behaviors between those two groups, then it's a great insight as to where a problem might be. So again, we've got an example, and this is all Zuko data, it's real life data that you can see here. You've got the form, the field labels on the left, and then what we've got that in the highlighted boxes here with the red bars around, we're looking at, okay, in what proportion of sessions did someone return to this particular field? So for taking as an example, the rent mortgage field, if you look in the red box, in 10%, just over 10% of sessions where people abandon, people go back to that field, the rent mortgage. And by that, I mean, they return, they complete the field, they move on, they have to come back, potentially, and most usually driven by an error message. The equivalent figure for completed sessions is just under 7%. So there's a difference there. What we've done at Zuko is automatically highlight where there's a statistically significant difference between those two. And you can see that with a little red box around the 10.35. But so when you have that sort of difference, it's evidence that there's very likely an issue that is causing people to abandon with this particular field, because people are having to go back to it and they can't fix it, so they abandon. So that's a sort of red flag there. You sometimes, if you look at the home telephone number here in this particular data, you can see the opposite situation where people who successfully complete the form return to the field more often. Now, this is probably slightly less worrying. It generally indicates there's probably some sort of usability issue, but that people who are motivated to complete the form can get past it. So in this case, with the home telephone number, it might be a formatting issue, like add your international dialing code, for example. And people who are not that motivated might just get annoyed and leave, whereas those who are motivated may come back and do that. But the main thing is to look at the difference in behavior, because that's where you'll start to see the issues in particular parts of your form. The next thing to talk about is the submit button. You saw on the table a couple of slides ago, there was quite high abandonment rate around the submit button. Does this mean the submit button's bad? Is there something up with that? Well, sometimes you have a technical issue, but more often than not, it's to do with the error messages that are getting. So issues that people are having with another particular field in the form, but they're just dropping off when they see the error messages. So you need to find some way to surface what's going on there. Now, you may have set up error message tracking. So you can do that in Zuko, but there's also other tools you can use. And I'm going to use Zuko's example here of our field flow report, where you can find out what's going on. The way this report works is, if you look on the left, we've selected a field, in this case, the submit button, and on the right, it's kind of what happens next. What do they do after they've clicked the submit button? This has been filtered by those people who ultimately abandon. So what do they do? So you can see they click the submit button, and quite a significant proportion go to abandoned. So they're just abandoning straight away, which obviously tells you something, but it doesn't tell you exactly where the issue is. But what's interesting is, if you look at the fields below it, it gives you where are they going back to try and fix, but ultimately abandoning. Now, this is a pet insurance form that we're looking at here, so hence the reason you've got animal name, select your product, and animal birth date. So you can see people are going back in there, and actually they're having issues with these particular forms. I mean, I guess that the third one's quite interesting. Knowing the birth date of your animal, maybe a lot of people know that, but maybe people don't. So actually, are you asking questions that are irrelevant and you don't need to be there? But the base point here is essentially, if you can find out where people are having to go back to when they're trying to submit and then abandoning, you know where the issues are in your form. And then one last piece of data, which hopefully you can see there, is looking at the difference in mobile and desktop behavior. That's always a very important segmentation to do, because often you'll find that people have different pain points in desktop than they do in mobile. And so you can see here in the highlighted boxes, I've got mobile on the top left. You look at the contact number, there's the contact number makes up 7% of total abandons, and it's about 2.5% abandon rate. Whereas for desktop, it's making just under 15% of abandons, and it's got 3.6% abandonment rate. So obviously people in desktop are struggling with it more than in mobile. So that's why you should be looking at that, where you see a big difference between the two. Conversely, the email field here is the opposite. So for mobile, there's a 7.5% abandonment rate on it, and there's only a 3.8% abandonment rate on desktop. So that tells you something. Quite likely to be do with the formatting, which Abi will come on to, in terms of actually, do you have the right keyboard? Are you causing user problems with this particular field? But obviously this is a key segmentation you need to look at as well. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of how actually to use real life data to identify where the problems are with your form. So I'll hand back to Abby now to talk about evaluating your form.
Cool, thank you very much. Okay, so how do we evaluate forms? And the first thing I want to say here is it's actually about the mindset in which you go into this particular challenge. So this might be what you think your users do when they're filling out your form. It's all perfectly logical, straightforward, no distractions, it's all awesome, can't wait to do it. But what we can see from various user research, as we've just talked through, is actually a bit kind of like this. So this is a magic roundabout in Swindon, which is not too far from where I live. And as you can see, instead of being one roundabout, it's like 8 roundabouts around a big roundabout, and it's utter chaos. I've only driven around it twice myself, and each time was terrifying. But there's traffic going left, there's traffic going right, there's traffic going contraflow, distractions everywhere. And this is kind of the mindset that you need to be in when you're filling or evaluating your user forms. So I don't want you to be thinking about you as a professional that trying to assess your forms as best you can. I want you to be thinking about it as a user who is typical on your website. So maybe it's a mum who's got kids crying in the background, maybe it's a dad who's trying to cook dinner, whatever it is. When users are filling out your forms, it's very often not the case that they have a tranquil environment and they are not being distracted. They are all over the place, like a bag full of spiders. So try and think about that when I'm telling you about how I evaluate forms, which we will go through a checklist now. Okay, so these are all relatively low risk activities that you can carry out. We'll talk about some other stuff later, which you might not want to do or approach with caution. But the first thing you want to look at is kind of like the general error handling. So what would happen if you enter nothing into that form and then hit submit? You might find it's a very different experience than if you go through it logically step by step. What happens if you miss a mandatory field out? What does the error handling do there? What happens if you miss all of the optional fields because they're optional and then hit submit? Are there actually some hidden mandatory inputs in there that you didn't realize were there? That's happened a few times to me. What happens if you enter unexpected data into an input? So too many characters, I don't know, copy and paste them lorem ipsum. What does that do? Special kind of characters, so exclamation marks, dollar signs, example, Unicode, or just basically the wrong type of data than the input is suggesting that you should put in. So what happens if I enter numbers into an input that is expecting characters? If your form requires an upload of some kind, what happens if you try to upload the wrong format of file or a file size that is quite large? How does the form handle that? What happens if you enter a malformed email address? Does your form provide suggestions as to what it might be, or does it totally fail? Another good one to try is entering wonky postcodes. So entering a O instead of a 0 is always a good one to try out. And then what happens with the timing of your errors? So do the errors trigger at the right time? So not too soon, for example, and certainly not once a user has gone through all of the form and then hit submit. We don't want to be showing error messages at that point. Do the errors clear when they're corrected? Is the user told when the data is valid that they've entered, and when are they told? The placement of the errors and the styling, we don't want to see them all at the top or all at the bottom. Because of viewport issues, they might be missed. The errors need to be close to where the problem is. And also making sure we have the provision of not only just color highlighting, so typically green for good, red for bad, but you also need to provide helpful error copy when an error has happened. Any other further points on that, Alan?
Yeah, well, just I suppose to put some quantification on this in terms of moving error messages to, say, an inline error message handling that trigger at the right time. So when typically the right time is when a user moves from one field to the next, so they've essentially completed that field, but before they hit the submit button. There was a study done by Luke Roblinski, and I think there was a 22% increase in conversion rates just by sorting out your error messages. And it's the one thing that we see consistently make a big difference to forms. If you can sort out the timing and the nature of your error messages, you do get that you can get that 20% uplift in conversion. So it's one thing that we always focus on a lot once we've identified where the issues might be on a form.
Yeah, brilliant. Certainly not things like this field is a required input. I see that too frequently and it's just sloppy, but I'll stop complaining. Right, moving on. So the next thing to look at would be the ease of use of the form generally. So some points that people often miss out: is the form keyboard accessible? So if I'm on a desktop, can I tab through that form using the tab key? And if I can tab through it, what order am I taking in? So is the order that the cursor moves logical, for example? This is particularly important for when you have a lot of desktop traffic, or if the form is very complicated and it's the sort of thing that you would do on desktop, making sure that's correct. It also has accessibility implications as well. So does having the correct input labeling. For accessibility reasons and people that use screen readers, this is really important, because if they don't know what the input is expecting, they can't really fill it out correctly. As you mentioned earlier, making sure if your user's on a touch device, the right virtual keyboard type is triggered depending on the input required. So if we're asking for a phone number, let's make sure we've got a numeric keyboard being triggered, not the sort of QWERTY implementation. Again, for touch devices, making sure there's sufficient white space to actually sort of navigate that form without tapping on the wrong thing. Slightly more controversial one in that copy and paste is allowed. There's nothing more infuriating if you've gone to the effort of creating and managing your passwords in something like LastPass, and you get to a website and it tries to autofill from your browser extension and it doesn't work because somebody's disabled copy and paste into an input. Also important if you are expecting users to confirm things like email addresses or passwords, it's something that needs some consideration, and obviously depending on the security side of it, it needs a bit more evaluation. And if you're going to insist on a password, either to create one or to enter one, just make sure you're making it easy for the user. So password rule validation is super important. And if you're going to do that, make sure it's easy for them to understand.
Yeah, and I think there's studies out there that if you make it too complex, it actually makes things less secure, because people just revert to what they know and just add a 1, 2, 3 at the end, or what have you, yep. Which is obviously less secure than say 3 random yep. words as part of the password.
Yes, exactly. So passphrases, for example, are quite good. There are other ways to do it, such as 2-factor authentication too. That also makes things a lot easier. A couple of links at the bottom of this slide for you to have a look at. So, creating accessible forms, and also some guidance on the correct virtual keyboard types for touch devices. So the next thing to have a look at would be the data. And this is where you really want to think like a user, okay? So invariably, they won't start a form and fill it out all in one go. Sometimes they half complete a form, leave it and then return. So what's the data timeout like? Is it sufficiently long enough? And then also traversing funnel steps. So if, for example, you're in a checkout, moving back and forth between each of the steps, what data is retained or lost, and what data should be retained, and what data for security reasons needs to be cleared. You need to understand the what's and ifs of that and try to retain it wherever possible. Things like editing billing and delivery addresses and quantities, try it. So if you get all the way to your payment page and you want to edit the delivery address for some reason, what is the process like to do that? And also, are those changes updated when you go back to the payment page? And if you're asking for data in a strictly defined format, such as date of birth, you've got to provide the guidance for that. If you're not providing a suitable UI or UX implementation that allows the data to be entered correctly, make sure you're telling your users how to do it. You must have some insights on date of birth entry fields, Alan, maybe. No, he's gone. Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, so definitely, it's always tell them what you need, what format. It's particularly date of birth. We know that the most effective one is 3 separate text boxes. Once you start going into drop downs and date pickers, you get people having to scroll back many years to find the date of birth. It's not particularly good. So yeah, you need to, but yeah, tell them what they want, what you specifically need, and also why. Because actually often you find that if you don't tell people why you need some information, date of birth and phone number being quite common, then they'll just leave you because they just don't trust you.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, in terms of styling, we want to make sure the form labels are clear and well placed for readability. There are lots of arguments as to where form labels should be. I would suggest experimenting and work out what works best for your users. Also check the contrast on form labels. More often than not, the contrast is too low, which makes them difficult to read. Your label should always be persistent also. So none of these in-field labels that disappear when you tap into the input, that's not great. And if you do use in-field labels or helper text, for example, make sure that's cleared when the focus on that input is given, and return that tooltip or label if the data is cleared. So no hidden labels. Another key point is to make sure that inputs look like inputs. Let's make it perfectly clear to the user what they're expected to be done here. So that's an affordance guideline. And also that the input type is optimal for the data required and the device it is presented on. And there's 2 really good links on this slide that you can go and take a look at, and that's the GovUK design system. I love the GovUK website for a few reasons, but their forms are generally on point. They might not look the prettiest, but they are the easiest for a user to grasp hold of. And another good touch point for you here would be the Baymard website. If you don't have a subscription, I'd suggest you look at investing in one. The resources they have on there are invaluable. Any further points on that one, Alan? Still on mute.
Sorry,
still on mute?
Yeah, nothing particularly to add to what you said there.
Okay, cool. Another area to look at is the copy. So make sure your error messages are helpful and not generic. Provide some kind of security messaging when a user's going through a form, just so that they know that their data is secure. That is still frequently missed on websites. Provide trust tooltips for sensitive data, such as date of birth, as in we're not going to abuse this data. Helpful tooltips for complex data, such as passwords, and explanatory tooltips for bigger asks, such as emails. So tell them why you want something, just to clarify to the user that you're not asking them for this information for no reason at all. Viewports are particularly important on touch devices and mobiles and tablets. You want to make sure that the tooltips and errors remain within the viewport so your user can see them. Also ensure that they can be dismissed easily as well. So provide something tangible that they can tap on to get rid of any kind of tooltips. A good example is the CVV code for credit cards. Often there is a "what is this?" and link, and if you tap on that, an error, a message appears way out of the viewport and screws everything up, and then you can't get rid of it. Another thing to check would be to ensure that auto zoom is disabled on iOS devices. So this is what happens when you tap on an input on a mobile phone and the whole page zooms in. That requires your user to zoom back out again and add it, just gives extra friction to the form, which isn't required. And also an important point here, despite people saying it, the fold does actually matter. You need to make sure it's clear that any form progression needs to happen. So just make sure all your salient points are within the viewport. Another point that gets missed on forms is that if you're using any kind of integrations, what happens if they fail? What happens if you're using reCAPTCHA and that fails? Does it prevent your form being submitted? What is plan B? What happens if your payment gateways fail? Is there a plan B there, for example? In fact, any kind of integration, you need to be thinking about what happens if. You also need to think about the thank you page or once a form is submitted and any other sort of way that the user is notified once that form has been completed. Do they receive an email, for example? I'm the sort of person that will leave a browser window open once I've made a purchase and with the confirmation, and I won't close that until I've received an email notification that my order has gone through. So have a think about the ways that your users notified that all the effort they've put into your form has been worth it. You've heard them, you've received the information, and you're dealing with it. Some things you can do, but I wouldn't suggest doing them unless you've got somebody who knows what they're doing to check your forms. So to check for cross-site scripting, checking for SQL injection, and then modifying form variables on the client side, which is something that you can do with DevTools. Again, really you want to be looking at a technical QA or a developer to check these things, and it's not something that you do on a live site unless you fancy dicing with death. There can be some massive implications. So if you really want to check out the integrity of your forms, kind of look up some people that can help you with these three things, just to see that your forms are secure and they're going to withhold any kind of attacks or anything like that, which sounds scary, but probably worthwhile doing. Okay, so we've gone through my checklist, all the research points that you can look at, all of the tools that you might use. What do you do with all this information once you've got everything together? Well, you need to triangulate all of the pain points. So you need to log all of your issues and then group them by type. And here's some suggestions. So is it an error handling problem? Is it a cognitive load problem? Is there a high abandon rate on it? Is it an accessibility problem? Or is it an actual functionality bug? And then you really want to identify how many times that particular problem has been flagged in your research areas. And once you've done all of that, you need to then order and prioritize those problems. I tend to order stuff by just do it. So the things that should just be fixed because it's stupid or silly, stuff that you might want to A/B test if you've got the capability, things that you might need to measure. So if you can't A/B test, do before and after metrics and see if you made an improvement. And then there's a gnarly subject of difficult business stuff. So things that are going to require a bit of red tape and effort to get approved. And you can put all of this stuff into a framework. There's some examples here. So CXL's TXL framework or conversion.com's SCORE framework. And you can modify these to suit your business case and business goals. So things that I would consider just do it. For mobile, wrong virtual keyboard types for the input type, auto-correct triggering, auto-capitalize triggering, auto-zoom on input focus, affordance and white space issues, information above the fold, making sure that your errors are not triggered on post-submit, improving inline validation, not too soon and not too late, improving generic error messages, getting rid of any tiny red text or just color highlighting of errors, poor instructions, lack of explanation as to why you need something, so trust building. For layout, I would be removing any in-field labels that disappear or that don't clear. Looking at field size and the expected input. So there's no point in having a massive input that fills the entire viewport if you're only expecting 3 or 4 characters, for example. Clarity of mandatory or optional fields. affordance and space, the keyboard accessibility and tab word, the ability to show the password. This infuriates me. It's one of my biggest pet hates if I can't see the password that I've just typed in to make sure it's correct. Related to that would be if your users have password managers, then invariably the password manager will appear within inside the field input, and that's going to interfere if you've then provided the ability to show a password. They're both within the input, so make sure if you're showing the password, put the ability to do that outside of the input. Removing any distractions, and please don't nobble the ability for a user to escape your form. Provide them a get out of jail free card. Some thinking suggests that once your user is in your funnel or doing your form, that's the only place they should be. They should never go anywhere else. I disagree with that. So provide some kind of navigation for them to return to your homepage or other areas of the site. Things to test and measure. The label positions and the font sizing, grouping and chunking of the information you're requiring, and also the order in which you ask it. Input sizes and types. This one is quite interesting, input sizes and types. You can do a lot of testing around that. Other things to look at would be passwords and usernames. So what are your rules and validation like? How are you presenting those errors and what is the copy? The tooltips that you're using, any password requirements, and the process to reset or recover your account information or username or password or combination of those. Another interesting point to have a look at would be increasing friction. And why would you want to do that? There's a link here that gives great insights into why you might want to add friction onto your website. Usually generating around the quality of the leads that you get, if that's your thing. And also, I've noticed in the testing that I've done in the past that if something feels too easy or too fast, that's actually detrimental. So adding a time delay, for example, on an insurance quote form, when your insurer's gone off to look for your quotes, if that doesn't take a sufficient amount of time, the user will think that you have not done your best effort to get the best quote. So difficult business stuff. I'm going to run through an example very quickly here because we're running out of time. But really it's based around evaluating each form input and whether or not it's really needed. Why is it a problem and how is it a problem? What would be the impact be if it disappeared? Who needs to decide if it can go? And building a business case to keep or remove an input from your form.
And sorry, just to add to that, that's something we do come across a lot. Like we often get, particularly in financial services, a lot of forms where there are fields that the marketing team will kind of want to get rid of, but they can't because somewhere in the business, someone's decided it's needed for a quote or believes it's needed. And so, yeah, that always is a difficult conversation.
It is, but it's a fun one.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a look. So this was an e-com site that I was working on, and the checkout had loads of steps and loads of forms. It had personal details, address details, a previous address details search, payment method, and whether you wanted personal credit or pay on receipt, an income declaration if you went for a credit account, terms and conditions, review order, and then a confirmation. So loads of steps. But through the research that we did, we kind of identified the main pain points were on the personal details page and the address details page, especially around providing previous address details. So this is what the control looked like. This is not the actual page for clarity. It's a very rough mock-up of what it did look like. But you can see we had personal details here on the left, login details, personal details, phone numbers, an account application detail, loads of yellow distraction-y stuff on the right-hand side, and then the user got booted to entering their address details, similar sort of template, loads of distractions on the right, kind of flaky postcode lookup, and then a big green box, and it was also asking how long a user had lived at the previous address. So on first sight of this form, I felt a bit like this because I knew there was a lot of opportunity to improve it, but I also knew it was going to be a massive task to do that and require a lot of toing and froing and agreements. So the first point that we looked at was, and the first time I came across Zuko was for this product, and we ran it and we kind of figured out which were the most difficult inputs for users. So the yellow is users that dropped off, the blue is the time it took them to complete it, and the purple is the number of corrections users made. And as Alan pointed out earlier, it was kind of device dependent. So there are a lot of commonalities between desktop and mobile, but slight variances depending on the device. But we knew that email and password hints and years at address were all problematic, and these are just kind of like the top 10 or so. So we had a look at that data, and then we did device testing and an expert review on it. We tested on an iPhone 6S, an iPhone 5, an iPad, and Windows Chrome at 1366 by 768. We got over 80 UX issues and bugs in total, but more importantly, what we saw from the device testing and expert review was what we saw in the Zuko. But now we had the reasons as to why, because we'd run through the funnel and identified them. We also had to ask questions to the business. So things like, so why do users have to confirm the email address? Why do they have to confirm the password? And with all of these questions, we would get a response, which was usually reluctant or unwilling to change anything. And then we would always reply with, well, what if we did this? What if we did X, Y, or Z? So offering them an option. We also tried to identify who it was that we needed to speak to directly to get an answer to something, and just to generally question the business as to why things were implemented in the way that they were. We also knew that this was a fairly risky area to be A/B testing in. It's a checkout after all. So we had to kind of do some ask coverage, for want of a better word. We had to come up with a load of mitigations against questions like, well, what happens if the information isn't entered correctly? What happens if the test bombs when it goes live? What happens if a stakeholder or department complains? What happens if the customers start to complain? So the first attempt that we had looked a bit like this. We moved the personal details to the start of the form, changed the date of birth entry format, put age restriction messaging near to the related input, so why we were asking them for the date of birth, simplified the phone number entry, clarified why the email address was required. We also pre-filled in the login email address that they had provided in the your contact information rather than asking them to complete it again. Added some simple password rules and added the ability to view the password. On the address details, we decreased the prominence of the optional fields. A BFPO is a British Forces postal address, so these they had a few customers from there, but we decreased the prominence of it. We also added a new block for the years of address, so chunking the information, and clarified the order update section. And it went okay, but we had some findings. We realized that the title wasn't being used. If users went through the funnel, the date of birth wasn't retained. Users who forgot they'd had an account that they'd already set up got booted out of the funnel entirely because of a control functionality issue. Additional phone numbers weren't being entered. Email addresses were still being incorrectly typed in. There were errors meeting the password rules, and the order preference number was being used incorrectly. We also saw a lot of excess scrolling, and people were tending to opt out of the marketing opt-ins before they even did anything else on the form. And the users frequently went back to their basket. For the address section, we noticed the postcode lookup was being missed, failure to select the address options when they were presented to the user. Users weren't filling in the months for the time lived at address. The time at address data wasn't being retained when the user went back and forth through the funnel. and the business had some questions about where the marketing opt-ins should be displayed. So we had another go, and this was the second iteration. So we added some inline validation, more clarification, beefed up the password validation rules as well, and further clarified the opt-ins. The About You section from the first iteration did well, but we improved the inline validation. And then we moved the address section into a multi-step with progressive disclosure. So we only showed the postcode lookup to start off with, and then progressed it. So once they'd entered the information and looked for the address, it was presented in a drop-down list. Once they selected from the drop-down list, all of this information was pre-filled. We also removed the month requirement from years lived at the address. And we only showed previous address information if the user selected 2 or less from the years lived. We also only displayed a mobile number update if the user selected that they would like updates about their order. And the net result of all of that was a 2.9% increase in conversions, about a £2.3 million uplift, and a 1.8% increase in the completion of form pages. So the key takeaways were to use self-efficacy to motivate and help users complete a task. Your form filling really requires system 2 thinking, so remove all the distractions, remove any unnecessary form requirements, and reduce the cognitive load. So things like chunking information, logical sequencing, progressive disclosure, providing help for trickier inputs such as passwords, providing optimal inputs for the data entry required, and ensuring that the mobile UI and UX is optimal. Also helping users fix mistakes, or even better, prevent them from making them in the first place, and reduce the effort to complete any sort of task you're asking. So the general summary from this whole topic would be that your forms are an inevitable part of your funnel, okay? Bear in mind that whilst your forms might be working, dependent elements may not be, so you need to look out for those. You really need to be optimizing forms for the order of information requests that you make to your user. Figure out the information that you really need to ask, and the information that your user is willing to offer to you. The UI and UX of inputting data depends on the device, so you need to optimize on a device dependent level. Provide as much clarity and feedback as your user works through the form as possible, and basically reduce the workload for your user, not you yourself as a business. So remembering about retained information and trying to limit that cognitive load. And remember, it's not really just about the form, okay, and the form conversion rate. Your entire user journey and what you're offering will influence how well your forms convert. So how high is that user's desire to attain a goal? At the very start of this pandemic, when everybody went into panic mode, I found myself on websites I'd have never been on trying to order food and other things. And I went through some pretty awful forms just to get what I wanted, because my user desire was so high to purchase that product. So depending on the desirability of what you have will kind of depend on how well your forms convert. Do loads of research, lots and lots and lots, as much as you can. And don't give up without a fight. The example that I walked you through earlier, that was probably a good 2 months worth of negotiating and planning with the client, but it really was worth it. And you saw that in the uplift figures that we attained from running that. And I think that's it. Yeah. Alan?
Well, thank you very much, Abby. And minimal swearing, I'm disappointed.
Oh, I'll make it up next time, sorry.
So that's it. Thanks for your time today. We will do Q&As for those who can stick around, but I appreciate that we're kind of out of time. But a couple of things first. So, firstly, if you want to improve your forms and you want to discuss anything with us more, we've got our details there for Abby and myself. If you want to have a chat about anything or just an opinion on your form, then feel free to ask us. If you want to learn more, we do have Zuko have created a big chunky book on form optimization and form analytics on how to improve your forms, which the link is there to download. And I should say that we will share all these slides with everyone afterwards, as well as the recordings if you want to share with anyone. So you'll be able to get that there. And also, if you want to hear more from Abi, she will be at Experimentation Elite Conference in March of next year in London. That's correct, isn't Abi?
Oh, yep. Who knows these days? Who knows what's going to happen?
You might be there virtually, but
yeah,
hopefully everything will be okay. So let's see if we can cover off the Q&As that have come in this time. So Lena, have we had some Q&As and questions coming?
Yep, we've had a few coming through. So I'll just start with the first one that came through. So that's basically, what do you suggest the max fields per page is, and what do you suggest for very long forms where pagination isn't viable and all fields must be on one page?
So I'll preface the answer to this question. We do have an article on this in the Zuko blog. So if you Google Zuko multi-step forms, there's an article which covers off a lot of this. I think max fields per page, the main principle is to chunk together similar questions. Yep. So if that's personal details, financial details, that's kind of what dictates it. I mean, typically between 3 to 6 is kind of where we typically see it. I don't know if you agree with that, Abi, but that's kind of what we tend to see.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I think it's okay to have a long form. What I would be avoiding is what I call an Andrex form. So that's a form that's presented to the user and it just goes on and on and on the page. But there are ways around that. If you only have one page to present that form information, then certainly by using progressive disclosure, so showing one element at a time or one group at a time, and then once that is completed, displaying the next section on the page. That can be beneficial. What you don't want is your user to load up your form and wishing that they were dead by the time they got halfway through it. So it's about chunking the information and reducing that system to load. That's the best way to approach it. In terms of field numbers, I think that's highly dependent, like we said, on the goal to attain whatever it is that you're offering. So I'd probably be looking at A/B testing around that to find the optimal solution.
Yeah. I'm going to jump ahead. There is a question that's come in the chat that's linked to that, so we might as well cover it. I think Jake says, do you find breaking a form into 2 or 3 steps helps increase form completion rates? In tests I've been involved in, it doesn't make a significant difference. In terms of the research that I've seen, and it's in the blog, it tends to be, it either has not much impact or it does have a positive impact. It's very, very rare that I would see a single page form perform significantly better than a multi-step form. I don't know about if that's what you found, Abi.
Well, yes and no. I think it's so highly dependent on the website. It goes back to that big old argument of best practice, doesn't it, really? Yeah. So I think unless you're regularly sort of trying to figure out yourself what the optimal solution is, there is no right or wrong answer to that. I would say keep trying. My personal preference is not to be presented with a massive amount of information in one go. You can see that users generally don't like that either, you know. And if you have to present it all in one go, then what options are you providing for them to save that information and come back to it at a later point? A good example of that would be the passenger locator form that I had to fill out before I returned from the Netherlands recently. It was a massive form. I got halfway through it, 10 minutes into it, and then it said, oh, you can't complete this form now, which would have ordinarily pissed me off right royally. There you go, you got some swearing in. Yeah. But luckily there was an option to save it, so therefore it was not a problem. And I could come back to that when my 48 hours was due. So yeah, that's what I would suggest anyway. If it's massively long, allow them to save it. The general preference would be not to overload your user with too many requests at once.
Makes sense. Lena, next question.
Sure. So next question is from Andy, and it goes, when you talk about tracking form errors in GA, Abi,
Yeah.
Is that in GA4 or is it in Universal Analytics, or do both versions support it?
So I think Charles would be your person to speak to about this. He is the GA person, not me. I just break the forms and take the information from him about what I need to break. I believe his solution there relates to GA3. But feel free to drop Charles an email, have a read of the article that I linked to in the document, and he'll be able to fill you in.
And just to build on that, because Zuko can pull in error messages that you can set up in GA, and typically people set it up as a, well, it's Google Tag Manager actually, but
yeah.
it's triggers on when an element is shown. Typically an error message pops up, that's tagged, you tag it up and it'll pull through. I think it might be quite similar for Universal.
Yes, it's a similar sort of, yeah, no, it's a similar implementation. So you just look for the unique identifier, provided your error message has one. So that would be some groundwork to do before you look at that particular implementation to track the errors.
Okay.
Cool.
I know I've answered also a question. I think Helen asked about the name for the error messaging study. I've put the link in the Q&A in the answered questions for Luke's study, so people can visit that if they want to. Is the next question, Lena?
Sure, we have quite a few questions left. Do we have time to go through them all, or?
I'm conscious of time, so let's do two more, then pick a couple. And apologies if any of you don't get your questions answered. Please do email us. We'll be more than happy to.
Oh yeah, drop us a line. That's no problem.
Perfect. Okay, so the next question is, do you see a correlation between drop-offs at beginning of form versus end of form? So general mental load, or is it always field specific?
From a data perspective, from Zuko, you tend to see is kind of you get a high drop off at the start of the form. That's people who are probably not serious to complete your form. They drop off on the title or the name fields, and they're not difficult fields to complete typically, but they start and then think, okay, I'm not going to do this now. Now it's possibly because your form looks horrible and they're like, oh no, I can't do it. So you've always got to bear that in mind. So you often see that. And then you see at the end of the form, typically around the submit button, and that's, as I touched on before, is typically where they click submit and they get a field of red. They get a load of error messages. And they're like, oh no, I can't fix this now, I'm leaving. So that tends to be what it is. So it's probably more to the field specific. Certainly at the end of the form, it's about field specific, because they've not been able to fill in a particular field. They've got an error message and they've just given up.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, if a user gets to the end of the form, it shows some degree of high intent, right?
Yeah.
If they've made it this far, what's stopping them at the last hurdle? And like you say, that's usually a problem once they submit the form. So either the errors haven't been dealt with in line or as they go along, so they can fix them, and they're all presented after they've submitted the form, which is the worst feeling in the world. It's like being given an F when you were aiming for an A.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, but you will always see it on field level as well. So there are always going to be inputs that user will bail on. So asking for email addresses or dates of birth, anything a little bit sensitive like that, especially if the user can't grasp the context as to why you're asking that. So if you're filling in for a bank loan, for example, you kind of expect to put a date of birth in there, right? That's sort of information they're going to ask for. But you wouldn't expect to be putting in your date of birth in to make a purchase of I don't know, a pair of shoes, for example. Yeah. So yes.
Okay, one final question, Lena, do you want to?
Okay, so we can stick to the kind of topic of error messages and stuff. So do the colors of error messages depend on the culture of the region? So for example, China versus the USA?
Yes, there would be a sort of localization aspect to that. And also, I'm going to bang on about accessibility again, red and green. So what's the most common form of color blindness? It's going to be one of those, which is why I mention in there that you shouldn't be relying solely on color to highlight whether a user's done something good or done something bad. So the copy around that is also quite important. Alan, you were going to add something?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I don't pretend to be an expert on cultural differences, but certainly, and it could make a difference. But as you say, don't rely on the colours.
Yeah. But it's a good question because, you know, if you think about from a cultural point of view, it also affects the copy. So that's the sort of work that I've done. The copy you write for error messages, for example, in Germany is going to be very different for what you would write in the UK, for example. So it opens up, if you're kind of operating cross country or cross borders, whatever you want to say, internationally, then it's worthwhile taking a localized approach to, if you're A/B testing that and seeing what works best in that territory.
I'm going to use that as an excuse and a segue to answer one more question, because cultural difference reminds me. Christoph has asked twice. I think we should ask him, how does the address search button work, the one next to postcode field? And I think it's a cultural difference because in the UK, that's pretty well known how it works in the UK, but in other countries, it might not work. If you want to explain how that works, Abby.
For a UK audience, what are postcodes in the UK? So a postcode in the UK kind of like narrows down the location of a property or an address to, I don't know what, it's not very much, is it?
It's about 20 or something like
that.
About
20 or so. So for me here in the sticks, as in the countryside, that's going to be 20 and also addresses, whereas in London it could be, you know, 100 addresses. But the idea is everybody has their own unique postcode to a degree within that sort of parameter. And when you enter that postcode and hit find address, it will produce a list of all the addresses that are listed within that postcode. And then you can select your address and then all the information is pre-filled. I think that's the easiest way to explain it. I don't know.
Click it, basically gives you put in your postcode, you click the button, it gives you a selection of addresses rather than having to fill out the whole thing. It's much quicker and improves conversion rates. And seeing as Michael has asked the same question again, let's take Michael's final question as the absolute final one now. I know we can
final.
So kind of, you can see it, Abby, but he's asking thoughts on login gateways versus forms each time. Also, if a certain question leads to a high abandonment rate, but you need that info. I'm not quite sure what that second part means, but say in terms of logging gateways versus forms, I'm assuming that's.
So we're talking about like logging with Google or Facebook or something like that.
Yeah, yes.
Social signups. I
mean, we've seen it can be very effective. Typically from, it depends on your audience though. You've got to be careful.
Very much so. So being a 44-year-old midlife crisis kind of woman, I hate social media, so I would never use social sign-in for anything, but that's me, that's my demographic, and that's my general hate of Mark Zuckerberg and various other things. But a younger demographic, they may well be more receptible to that. So perhaps an interesting thing to do would be to segment your experiment and run it against your different demographics, so people who you think might be more accepting of social sign-ins. And then showing it to them, and for your older demographic, if it applies to you, giving them a conventional kind of sign up and login form as they would probably expect.
So and always giving the option, but also we see different usage rates between B2B and B2C products, because B2B people are very reticent about giving their personal data in a business context often. So often we see that B2C tends to perform better. And then Michael's just finally, he's clarified his second question. So if you see a specific question on a form leads to abandon rate, but you require the information, what would you do? So I guess the issue is that the question itself might not be causing the problem. It might, the user may, again, we don't know on the question, they may be happy to give you the information. It may be an issue with a number of things. So it may be the validation. So classic example being phone number. They try and give you their phone number and you say no because you need a +44 or you need spaces or whatever. It could be the error messages are not good and not helpful and they don't know what to do. It could be that your instructions, your micro copy at the start's not good, so you've not explained it. It could be you've not explained why you need that information. That's always basically what you need to do. Always explain why. And I say that there's research out there that phone number is always a big one. If you don't explain why you need someone's phone number, particularly if you're an e-commerce form and they're like, well, you've got my address, you've got my email, why do you need my phone number? If you have to ask it, tell them why. Look at those issues around it, even if we appreciate there will be some information you always need. Just look at the environment around it.
Yeah, and to give that a bit of context in terms of the example that I gave around requesting the number of years lived at a previous address, that's to do with at that point in time, that company, you had two options to create an account. One would be a credit account, and the other being a pay on receipt. If you applied for the credit account, the company actually ran a soft credit check on you. And that's why it required the number of years that you'd lived at your current address. The problem that we had was that was not explained further up in the funnel. So there was actually a separate piece of work to clarify why that would be requested if you were opening a credit account, and that worked really well. It's just presenting that information, perhaps before the user even gets to the point where they're filling it in, slightly further up. So the expectation is that, oh yeah, okay, it's a credit account. I'm going to have to provide some personal information. I kind of get that. So when they come across it in the form, it's not a massive surprise.
Great. Okay, we'll wrap that up there now. I know there's actually also a request about the link for Experimentation Elite. I know they've not got their website up yet, so you can probably find that soon. If you want to look at previous events, it was called Conversion Elite. So if you Google Conversion Elite, you can see what it looked like in previous years. Yep. But conscious we've run over.
Sorry.
If any more questions, then feel free to email us. And so thanks for attending today. And thank you, Abi, for a sterling presentation. So
no worries.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.